very bad feeling about this.
What can be said about a film that single-handedly redefined science fiction cinema, the blockbuster, franchises, merchandising, etc.? Quite a lot. But what can be said that hasn't been said a million times before?
We must be cautious.
Well, maybe it has been said a million times, but there are always stories worth telling.
Good luck.
Like the real story behind Auntie Beryl eloping with the local handyman, old Jed, just before his investiture ceremony as Archbishop of, well, it's not important.
You came in that thing? You're braver than I thought.
Well, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope.
What is it?
Your father's lightsaber.
This is the story of Star Wars. I mean, sort of. You can read along with me in your book, and you'll know when it's time to turn the page when you hear R2-D2 beep like this. Well, you could if there actually was a book, but anyway. In this video, we're looking at Star Wars, but we do begin with George Lucas's career leading up until Star Wars.
A person of some importance, as I believe.
So if you want to skip straight to talk on Star Wars, use the chapters or the timestamps in the description. Let's begin now.
Jabba, you're a wonderful human being.
Science fiction media, as in quite a bit of what's covered on this channel, can be whittled down to before Star Wars and after Star Wars. Star Wars was the little film that could, something made with a medium-sized budget for the time, with sound and visuals that redefined expectations of a science fiction space opera movie. Star Wars would also push the envelope of special effects. No, more than that. More. Much better. Star Wars was almost immediately what everything with a spaceship or a creature or a visual effect was compared to. And for a long time, anything not Star Wars would come off second best in such a comparison. Which is exactly what happened when I bet a month's salary on who would win in a fight, Mr. Spock or Dr. Spock.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
Normally we'd spend a chunk of screen time giving a very rough and mildly inaccurate scene breakdown, but I'm guessing you've probably seen this movie at least once, and mega guessing that you've probably seen it more than once, and then ultra guessing that a significant chunk of you have seen it many times. How many times? So many times.
Been waiting for you.
Basically, a space war in space leads to some droids wandering around a desert, being captured, sold to a moisture farmer, and then his nephew Luke triggers a hologram message which leads to Luke's uncle and aunt being char-grilled. Luke and his new mentor Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's totally not Padre Pio, charter a spaceship from this fella.
Okay, you guys got yourselves a ship.
Han Solo and his co-pilot Chewbacca will fly the group to Alderaan. Alderaan is destroyed by the Imperials, but Han won't give them a refund without charging a bullshit restocking fee.
Don't everybody thank me at once.
And then his ship, the Millennium Falcon, is captured by the giant Imperial space station, the Death Star. Ben's job is to knock out a force field, the droids have to open some doors, and Luke, Chewie and Han decide to rescue the princess, which they do, and then they're about to bugger off in the Falcon, where Luke has the nagging feeling that they've forgotten something.
Ben?
A dogfight between the Falcon and some TIE fighters goes swimmingly, and then there's a big battle between the Rebel fighters and the Imperial fighters, while Luke has to launch a torpedo that will destroy the Death Star. And then, to cut a long story even shorter, Chewbacca will get stiffed for a medal. In the late 60s, George Lucas had been a star in the film program at the University of Southern California. His student short film, THX 1138-4EB, had won awards for its audiovisual style, and he would soon get the chance to make a feature-length version for Warner Brothers, which came out in 1971 and died a death, with the studio not knowing what to do with an esoteric science fiction film. After that film's failure, Lucas's friend, Francis Ford Coppola, suggested that Lucas make something fun. Rising to the challenge, Lucas co-wrote and directed American Graffiti, another low-budget film, but this time he'd make something warm and fuzzy, which would look at the cruising culture of his youth in the 50s and 60s. American Graffiti wasn't expected by the studio to do much business and was nearly dumped by Universal as a television movie. But eventually it was released and became a massive hit, tapping into an early 70s wave of 50s nostalgia. American Graffiti would go on to become the third highest grossing movie of 1973.
Hey, you see this Milner, you tell him I'm looking for him, huh? Tell him I aim to blow his ass right off the road.
Lucas felt burned by the studios with their inability to get the director's vision, the cluelessness about how to market either film, and their insistence on fixing his films with relatively arbitrary cuts.
Thank you.
asshole. Lucas was determined that he would have the final cut on his future films, and with it, control over his career. American Graffiti was such a hit that George Lucas could do almost whatever he wanted, within reason. I mean, he couldn't go nuts and film a recreation of Rommel's North African campaign in Alaska. That just wasn't on the cards. Why Alaska? Well, apparently it was his dog's idea. Lucas had a Vietnam War film project that had been percolating for a while, where he would shoot it cheaply, documentary style on 16mm film. He eventually thought the Vietnam film in the early 70s would be too hard to sell, and the project would eventually be adopted by Francis Ford Coppola, where he instead made it as a grand and expensive epic, which would be released in 1979 as Apocalypse Now. Another idea that Lucas had been kicking around was a film about an archaeologist inspired by adventure serials that would eventually become Raiders of the Lost Ark. And then there was this other thing, which also had its genesis in serials, but the space-set adventures of Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. Lucas had at first tried to get the rights to Flash Gordon, but was denied, which then provided him with the impetus to create his own science fiction adventure. I mean, it's not as if Flash Gordon wasn't remotely inspired by what had gone before, just as A Hangover is inspired by what had gone before. George Lucas got out his yellow legal pad and began a treatment for something he at various times called the Journal of the Wills, Adventures of the Star Killer, but most of the time it was called The Star Wars. No studio executive was particularly interested in a science fiction film, with the exception of Alan Ladd Jr. at Fox. He'd seen American Graffiti before it blew up and decided he wanted to work with Lucas, so a deal was struck. Well, in theory, it took a long time for the actual deal to be finalised, but Lucas would be paid for developing the story, writing the script, and for directing, but not at a rate that you would expect for the director of one of the biggest films of 1973. George Lucas was prepared to trade the money he'd be due as a result of his newfound status in order to retain ultimate control. He had negotiated rights for sequels, which rarely happened at this level, and control of some merchandising rights, which was considered worth less than a cheap printer with low cyan. Oh, so you think you're going to print a black and white document without cyan? While the deal very slowly came together, George Lucas worked on treatments and then began to write a full screenplay. He would write several drafts, with characters, relationships, settings, and plots all changing between each draft. After the second draft, he'd realised he had too much plot to fit into one movie and cherry-picked several moments to put into one tighter script representing the middle of his story. At this point, it was Lucas's intention that he would tell the rest of the story in future films. The concepts of the Jedi and the Force were mostly there from the start, as were names like Mace Windy, his spelling, and Kyber crystals.
The Kyber crystals, that's what they're for.
Depending on the draft, the main character was either a boy or a girl, then the character was split into two, making Luke and Leia. Earlier drafts had a little more of a fantasy feel, in amongst all the mucking about in spaceships.
Looks like somebody's beginning to take an interest in your handiwork.
Lucas had been inspired by various movies and books, but it was when he heavily borrowed from the plot of Akira Kurosawa's film The Hidden Fortress that things started to fall into place. With each draft came walls of expositionary text that left most readers baffled. Often Lucas would need to sit with the reader to provide context with things like hand gestures, but he remembered a concept artist he'd met a few years earlier and hired Ralph McQuarrie to create concept paintings that he could show to various people to better give them a sense of what it was he was intending. Lucas jotted down some doodles on the basic shape of things like TIE fighters and X-Wings, and Macquarie produced a number of paintings that would go on to define the look of Star Wars. If you were a studio executive reading Lucas's scripts, you no longer had to use your imagination and see what the film might look like. Which was handy because, studio executives, imagination, However, now that they could see what it might look like, then came the existential dread about how much all of this might cost to make, particularly the special effects.
We're doomed.
Along with Macquarie's paintings, they had models made by Colin Cantwell, as well as storyboards and concept art from Joe Johnston, Alex Tavularis, and others. George Lucas and his producer Gary Kurtz had estimated a budget of $8 million would be doable, while Fox went around established special effects houses for quotes and discovered just how many effects house owners had space in their garage for a second Corvette. It goes much deeper than that. By the mid-70s, there weren't too many special effects houses still in business, and, like Orson Welles, they mainly worked on commercials.
This bickering is pointless.
This film about spaceships and creatures would live or die based on the quality of the effects. To date, the film with the best special effects involving spaceships was Stanley Kubrick's 1968 epic 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was a film where the effects cost more than half of the film's budget. Most of the effects were done with projection screens or double exposed film. While those effects were excellent and graceful, they were also slow and often static. For the Star Wars, Lucas wanted much more dynamic scenes of spaceships dogfighting. I once got bored and tried to see spaceships dogfighting at home by sticking plastic spaceships onto the collars of a border collie and next door's Jack Russell on heat. But all I ended up with was a tetanus shot, 5 stitches, and some adorable puppies. Lucas found the best way to control the effects process would be to form his own company, which was eventually christened Industrial Light and Magic.
It's all a lot of simple tricks and nonsense.
While he would have preferred to move his filmmaking operations to Northern California, Lucas was persuaded that ILM needed to be near the rest of the film industry in Los Angeles. Head of ILM, John Dykstra, had been working for effects legend Douglas Trumbull, and Dykstra felt the way to translate Lucas's vision of fast-moving spaceships was to use a new process called motion control. The idea had been developed for use in urban planning, but the general gist was that a camera was mounted on a programmable mechanical track where camera moves could be recorded or programmed, and the same moves could be repeated again and again. You could, in theory, program a camera to simulate a TIE fighter moving past a camera, and then repeat the move again and again to show a fleet of TIE fighters moving past the camera, without having to physically build a fleet of TIE fighters.
Oh, now you tell me.
Motion control is a bit like setting your self-driving car to take you home from the pub and it crashes into the same telephone pole each time. ILM would hire talented up-and-comers who for the most part hadn't been part of established effects houses. Many of these hires would go on to be mainstays of the VFX industries, and some would remain at ILM for years or decades. First, they had to physically set up the workspace that they'd rented in Van Nuys. Then ILM had to build a motion control camera and optical printers and all of the models. The traditional way of shooting a spaceship involved shooting the models with stars in the same shot. 2001 tried multiple exposures, which wouldn't work for Star Wars dynamic space battles. Here, ILM shot models against a blue background and then separately shot a suitable backdrop. These elements would be combined in an optical printer, which basically rephotographed the images. Blue screen is conceptually similar to chroma key in television, where you are removing a specific color from the image and replacing it with another image. But with film, the process was a little more involved. Here, in order to get a clean matte, ILM would need to make high contrast copies on black and white film, white on black and black on white, and then composite these 4 layers in the optical printer. It may sound needlessly complicated, but then so is parachuting into Disney World while dressed as Bugs Bunny. This is not just the process for compositing spaceships against stars, but also to combine actors with miniatures or a painted backdrop, or for integrating a matte painting in post-production. ILM and other vendors would use the optical printers for adding glows to lightsabers, blaster fire, but also for things like adding titles, captions, the opening crawl, wipes and picture dissolves. Of course, each time you used an optical printer, there was often a telltale loss of quality, since that combined footage was at least one extra generation away from the original camera negative. Because of the number of elements that would need to be composited together in the same shot in Star Wars, model footage was shot using obsolete VistaVision cameras that would give them a much higher quality raw image than the standard 35mm film used to film live action scenes. VistaVision as a format hadn't been used in years, where it was an early widescreen format invented by studios to counter the rise of television. It used standard 35mm film but ran through the camera horizontally to give a much cleaner widescreen image. Using VistaVision, ILM could avoid effects footage being noticeably grainier than the live action footage. Lucas had assembled footage of dogfights from old war movies and newsreels to show ILM the sort of thing that he wanted, and while they were building the equipment, the film editors would use the black and white footage as placeholders.
I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
To cast the film's leads, George Lucas interviewed everyone. He ideally wanted unknown young actors and got together with a director friend, Brian De Palma, who was also casting for his horror film Carrie. From these sessions he cast Mark Hamill, who'd mainly done a few things on television, and Carrie Fisher, who was the daughter of Hollywood stars Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher. She'd also recently made a memorable appearance in the movie Shampoo.
With the blast shield down, I can't even see. How am I supposed to fight?
Luke Skywalker was a young farm boy who was an excellent pilot who dreamt of going to the academy, just as his friend Biggs had recently done. When Luke triggers R2's message from Princess Leia meant for Obi-Wan Kenobi, the adventure that he so desperately sought would be his sooner than he could have guessed.
The Force?
The Force is what gives the Jedi his power.
Luke began as somebody who had never even heard of the Force before meeting Ben, and would become somebody who could start tapping into its powers by the film's conclusion.
But who's gonna fly it, kid? You?
You bet I could. I'm not such a bad pilot myself. We don't have to sit here and listen.
Luke was originally named Starkiller up until it came time for Mark Hamill to introduce himself to the princess.
Too little short for a stormtrooper.
I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you.
Princess Leia was a character who was sort of a twin of Luke in some drafts, and at this stage the pair were just two random teenagers who ran into each other. Leia spoke with a pseudo-British accent when on official business.
I recognized your foul stench when I was brought on board.
And off-duty spoke normally, as in American.
Will somebody get this big walking carpet out of my way?
But her hairstyle. People would go nuts over the space buns to the point where that's all you had to do to make a joke about Princess Leia.
It's not over yet.
It is for me, sister.
The roguish pilot character was a problem. Well, it wasn't. Harrison Ford wasn't initially considered since Lucas hadn't wanted to cast people from his previous film, where Ford had a small but memorable role in American Graffiti as racer Bob Falfa. But no one else seemed as right for the role as Harrison Ford, who by the mid-70s tended to spend more time working as a carpenter than as an actor. Ford was hired by the casting director to read lines with the actors under consideration in order to have Ford audition, but not audition. Wink, wink.
Had a slight weapons malfunction, but everything's perfectly all right now. We're fine. We're all fine here now. Thank you.
Harrison Ford's line readings were just the right amount of laid back to make the character who did not want to be a hero work. He's almost an anti-hero, or at least he was more of one. He didn't want to get involved in the rebellion, and when he had a chance to collect a reward or join the attack on the Death Star, he noped out.
Well, take care of yourself, Han. I guess that's what you're best at, isn't it?
And then, of course, the scene that still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, he saves Luke. This is Harrison Ford before he was Harrison Bored, and he didn't even have to horribly injure himself. Lucas's dialogue, even after several drafts, never really just rolled off the tongue, leading Harrison Ford to quip, "You can type this shit, but you can't say it. Move your mouth when you're typing." The smuggler Han Solo was intended to be a charming but selfish rogue, and variously a bit of a cowboy and a pirate.
Sometimes I amaze even myself.
Lucas, being a more technically oriented director, usually left it to his actors to figure out their characters, and on the original trilogy that approach seemed to work. Lucas would become famous or infamous for providing his actors with very limited feedback, usually only asking for another take that was either faster or more intense, or most often both. The casting sessions also show what the dialogue in Star Wars was like in earlier drafts.
Fear is their greatest defense. I doubt if the actual security there is much greater than on Aquilai or Sullus, and what there is most likely directed towards a large-scale assault.
It would be an understatement to say that never before has a red pen been wielded so effectively. Lucas was assisted on a later draft by his friends Gloria Katz and Willard Huyck, who previously had co-written American Graffiti with George Lucas. The budget was an ever-present issue, with later drafts condensing the number of locations that would be needed to be created. Due to the exchange rate at the time, Britain ended up being a cost-effective place to make most of the film.
Well, if there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that it's farthest from.
The film would be shot in the UK, mainly at sound stages at EMI and Elstree and at Shepperton Studios, with location filming in Tunisia. Part of the Millennium Falcon was built on a soundstage, and whenever the Falcon was shown in a different hangar, the rest of the set was rebuilt around the ship.
Should I have your ship standing by?
Evacuate? In our moment of triumph?
Supporting roles would be filled with a mainly British cast, along with any American or Canadian actors working in the UK. Peter Cushing, a star of many genre films, would play Imperial leader Grand Moff Tarkin, while Sir Alec Guinness, the star of films like Bridge on the River Kwai, was a known quantity who would play Ben, or Obi-Wan Kenobi. When Lucas decided quite late during shooting that Obi-Wan should die dramatically, he had to explain to Alec Guinness how this would give the character even more weight. In a small role was Denis Lawson as Wedge, where, of course, Lawson's nephew was future Obi-Wan Kenobi actor Ewan McGregor. As Chewbacca was Peter Mayhew, who mainly worked as a hospital porter. But as a Wookiee, he took being stiffed for a medal over the lack of a stepladder and a dearth of medallion ribbon with rather good grace. Though clearly, the Rebel Army are scared shitless by Wookiee roars. Chewie was Han's loyal sidekick and co-pilot. Yet it apparently took Han Solo several decades to ask Chewie to use his bowcaster.
I like this thing.
As Darth Vader, bodybuilder Dave Prowse filled the suit. Vader's voice would be provided by James Earl Jones, who did not want to be credited, and it was only years later on the special editions that he gained an on-screen credit.
You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away!
Vader was the ultimate costume in Star Wars. Darth Vader's suit is partly a survival suit, and partly something to scare the shit out of people. It was a major part of Vader's menace. I mean, you might initially think he's trying just a little too hard in trying to make capes happen, but then he chokes Captain Antilles and later uses his power on an Imperial rival. Look, we've all been there in a business meeting that's gone on far too long, and then your office nemesis Alec Smelly starts wanking on about plans or schematics or blueprints or whatever Alec Smelly usually wanks on about.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Darth Vader, it has to be said, is a bad sport in general. Anybody who dares challenge him to a round of golf always ends up choking. Vader was still subservient to Governor Tarkin, though Vader never calls him Gov. While he had his superiors, Vader was the true villain of Star Wars.
When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
Some of the last shots added to the film involved a last-minute change to imply that Vader had survived, which in hindsight turned out to be a good move. For a film that was so different, Lucas actually wanted parts of it to have a familiar and cozy feeling, a simple good versus evil theme, rather than the darker themes on display in so many 70s classics. One thing he wanted was an old-school Hollywood orchestral score, rather than the musique concrete and synthesized scores that had become popular with science fiction of the era. Not dropping any names, but his good friend Steven Spielberg suggested John Williams and played Lucas some of the score for his upcoming movie Jaws that Williams had composed. Also on the sound front, Lucas wanted something different for the sound effects. His sonic collaborator on previous movies, Walter Murch, was busy, and so he suggested recent graduate Ben Burtt. Burtt set about collecting a library of unique sounds, creating the iconic sounds of R2-D2, as well as dozens of spaceships and weapons. Most of the laser weapons started off as a twang from hitting a high-tension cable with a spanner. The lightsaber was the hum of a picture tube. Burtt also raided classical sound libraries where things like the TIE Fighter sound was based on the recording of an elephant. As a bit of an in-joke to other sound editors, Burtt used some death screams originally recorded for a 50s B-movie, and lo and behold, the Wilhelm scream would become first a cute gag for sound aficionados, and then it became a party that everybody wanted to go to, like a barbecue at Graceland, before finally becoming a party that nobody wanted to go to, like, E.T.'s Wake.
No, I don't think he likes you at all. No, I don't like you either.
John Barry, not the composer but the set designer, came on board as a production designer, knowing that time and his budget was going to be tight. From the get-go, Star Wars was not going to be a science fiction serial with minimalist white sets. Yes, I know the very first sets you see in Star Wars could be mistaken for a super chic hairdressing salon on Rodeo Drive, but soon we'll see a style where the sets are full of details. Just as the spaceships had a textured industrial feeling, so did many sets. The Star Wars universe wasn't sleek, but lived in. The costumes by John Mollo were relatively simple. You could be forgiven for thinking that perhaps Mark Hamill had just come back from his karate lessons, or that Han Solo was working as a roulette dealer at Caesar's Palace. Alec Guinness decided to prepare his costume by rolling around in the sand before filming his first scenes in Tunisia.
Hello there.
The stormtroopers with their vacuum-formed plastic armor were really the first sign that this wasn't just going to be a standard science fiction serial where the villains were just wearing military surplus uniforms. Though there's definitely an SS vibe with the Imperial officers. I mean, jodhpurs. Anyone outside of show jumping or directing movies in the 1940s who wore jodhpurs was always going to be evil. The rebel pilots wore variations of actual flight suits, while the Imperial TIE Fighter pilots wore a stormtrooper helmet with a rebel pilot helmet plonked on top. C-3PO's look was highly influenced by the robot from Metropolis. Actor Anthony Daniels' performance as a fussy British butler suited the script, even though Lucas had intended to dub in the voice with a different actor, perhaps having the character sound more like a used car salesman.
What plans? What are you talking about?
However, Daniels would be the one to provide 3PO's voice, as well as being in the uncomfortable costume. While every other costume was hot and heavy, they were at least flexible compared to the 3PO costume, which looked like it could do you a serious injury if you fell over the wrong way.
Help! I think I'm melting. This is all your fault.
C-3PO is a coward, but a useful coward, as he's an interpreter droid who can surrender in over 6 million forms of communication. He's annoying and annoyed at the same time.
But I'm sure it must be your fault. You watch your language.
R2-D2 may have looked like a cross between a Roomba and a trash can full of old computer parts, but he would become one of the most beloved creations in Star Wars. R2 may have had to rely on 3PO to translate for him, but he's not taking any of 3PO's shit.
Wait a minute, where are you going?
R2 was an astromech, which meant he served as a co-pilot in the back of an X-Wing or a mobile repair droid, where his cavities are full of tools. I could rephrase that, but I choose not to at this time. R2's main story function in this film is to be a flash drive with a built-in home theatre. R2-D2 was a radio-controlled prop when moving, but for close-ups, little actor Kenny Baker would operate the prop to give R2 so much of his spunk. Again, I could rephrase that, but we all make choices in life that we later regret. Star Wars was famous for its creatures, many of whom were created by Stuart Freeborn. Chewbacca the Wookiee was based on Lucas's dog Indiana, an Alaskan Malamute, while Chewie's voices were recordings of bears and walruses. One of the film's most iconic scenes was originally less iconic when Lucas decided he wanted even more variety of creatures. After Lucas wrapped filming and returned to the US, one of the things he needed was some pickup shots of various creatures created by Rick Baker, which were inserted into the main bar footage shot in the UK. The Cantina sequence has become one of Star Wars' most iconic scenes. If it wasn't for these pickups, the film's second wave of action figures may never have happened.
Yes, I bet you have.
For such a successful and influential film, the actual production was a painful and draining process for George Lucas, physically and emotionally draining. But by draining, we mean the various battles wore him down, rather than he was visited in the dead of night by a Grandpa Munster look-alike searching for a drink. The Tunisian footage looked marvellous and suitably alien, but the shoot was marred by a storm just as filming commenced. There were numerous problems with costumes and props. And funnily enough, it was very hot. Who could have foreseen that? The location used for the Lars home exterior was a hotel, though it's not in the discredited Stam Fine Hotel's loyalty scheme, where if you collect 10 stamps, you get the tiny soaps thrown in for free on your next stay. The British film crew, and George Lucas for the most part, did not get along. We're not talking oil and water, more like dinosaurs and very large rocks. Almost everybody on the crew at the time thought the film was some cheesy, low-rent disaster in the making. Lucas clashed with his director of photography, Gilbert Taylor. He had to try and adapt to the local crew's work practices, which included constant tea breaks, which of course would lead to constant piss breaks. Lucas would later fire his UK-based editor after the first rough cut was, well, rougher than a straight line cut by me. Lucas also felt his producer, Gary Kurtz, did not have his back enough, and then there were the VFX problems. Originally, Star Wars was meant to have been a film with a lot more in-camera effects. Some Falcon cockpit and land speeder scenes were originally filmed with front projection, but the results looked pretty poor. They would be reshot using the blue screen process, which added to the film's budget and scheduling woes. The lightsabers were rotating sticks covered in light-reflecting material with the idea that they would not require any additional optical enhancement. Well, that idea also worked about as well as the time Auntie Beryl claimed that she was in fact the real Tsarina Anastasia. The laser pistols were real weapons loaded with blanks, and it was originally hoped that that's all that would be required.
Bang, bang.
No, it's too late!
Bang, bang.
But both the sabers and hand weapons would have animated effects added by various vendors in post-production. Meanwhile, back in the US, ILM had spent a big chunk of their budget in research and development for the systems they would need to make the effects for Star Wars. John Dykstra had constructed his Dykstraflex motion-controlled camera, but the very first usable shot produced was the simplest, the escape pod launch. ILM was a fairly loose place with people working all hours, though by the end of production, things were tracked by project managers in order to see if they were going to be done on time.
Enemy fighters coming your way.
Most of the ship designs that made it to screen aren't too far off their early concepts. The initial design for the pirate ship, as it was known, was changed at George Lucas's request after he thought it was too similar to the design of the Eagles in the then new television series Space 1999. That rejected design was instead used as the basis of the Rebel blockade runner. Lucas decided he wanted something unique for the hero ship.
What a piece of junk!
What we ended up with came together fairly quickly and was nicknamed either the Hamburger or the Pork Burger. Two plates sandwiched together and taking the blockade runner's original cockpit and putting it on the side. As the Millennium Falcon, it's now one of the most famous spaceships in all media.
The Force will be with you. Always.
Star Wars was made in the editing. I mean, every movie is made in the editing, but parts of Star Wars only really made sense once things were cut together. Lucas shot much of the film with multiple cameras and rarely went for more than a few takes, going for speed over perfection. He also tended to yell cut the second he had what he wanted. Having fired the film's first editor, Lucas brought in editors Richard Chew, Paul Hirsch and his then-wife Marcia, all of them accomplished film editors, to start all over again with piecing together the movie.
The moon with the rebel base will be in range in 30 minutes.
Originally, the film's opening would be interspersed with shots of Luke watching the battle from the unnamed planet, and of him hanging out with his friends, including Biggs Darklighter. These scenes were cut, which tightened up the focus of the opening act, where there's actually very little dialogue apart from C-3PO doing the ultimate impression of an English tourist trying to get a decent cup of tea at Denis.
We seem to be made to suffer. It's our lot in life.
Obi-Wan Kenobi originally survived his battle with Vader in the shooting script, but it was felt that he didn't do much in the climactic Death Star battle other than quarterback Luke over the radio. So the idea was that Vader would kill Ben to give the film a bit of dramatic punch, and Ben's spirit would advise Luke.
If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
Even during shooting, Luke had made 2 attack runs in the Death Star trench, which was condensed to 1 run during the edit.
Use the Force, Luke.
In the final movie, there are short scenes showing the Death Star moving into range to destroy the Rebel base, all of which was concocted in post-production to ratchet up the tension, with judicious editing, reused footage, and voiceovers. Fox had spent so many years zigzagging between basking in the profits of an enormous hit and near bankruptcy. The studio didn't have major expectations for Star Wars, and so they applied the pressure. Particularly when shooting ran long and the effects budget slowly crept up, like that spider on your shoulder right now. No, the other shoulder. After principal photography wrapped, Lucas returned to the US, a shell of a man, and when he turned up to see how ILM were doing, his heart sank.
This is our most desperate hour.
With a firm release date and the studio breathing down his neck, Lucas began to crack the whip at the effects house.
Going somewhere, Solo.
Certain scenes had not come off as well as they would have liked, and Lucas managed to squeeze a little extra cash out of Fox for a few reshoots and inserts.
That is the idea, Solo.
We're not talking reshoots on the level of a movie in the 21st century, but an insert here, a few new creatures in the cantina, more Greedo, etc. A small unit headed off into the desert to shoot scenes of Luke's land speeder with doubles, and to grab footage of elephants dressed up as the Tusken Raiders' Banthas. I mean, elephant cosplay is not a thing you generally expect to see all that often outside of Halloween at the zoo. Star Wars had cell animation for computer screens and even some limited computer animation for the Death Star technical readouts. One of the more memorable scenes in the movie was when R2 and Chewie played 3D chess. The original idea would be to use actors in costumes, but since that had been done in the 1976 film Future World, stop-motion models were used instead. Check and mate, so-called Future World.
You can waste time with your friends when your chores are done.
George Lucas had shown a rough cut of Star Wars to his contemporaries. Very rough cut, with most of the effects footage still using placeholders from movies like The Dam Busters. Most of the reactions were polite, but not particularly enthusiastic, which is a bit like asking a waiter in an Italian restaurant if they've got any ketchup. Steven Spielberg, no stranger to watching a film with incomplete effects, loved it, while Brian De Palma hated elements of the story, particularly any talk about the Force.
Right now I don't feel too good.
De Palma did assist Lucas with rewriting the film's now famous opening crawl to make it flow a little less like a clogged pipe. Once ILM had gotten into a rhythm, the number of completed effect shots grew and grew. Star Wars was nearing the finishing line, and it was now time to talk about how to release the movie. Fox did not know what the hell to do with Star Wars. An early trailer was released to cinemas and managed to get some excitement building. Well, everywhere except at Fox. They couldn't get theatre owners to take the film, and so the movie would open in limited release before going wide. When the movie opened in late May of 1977, it was the hottest ticket around, and Star Wars quickly became a hit, and then a massive hit, and then a smash hit, and then a monumental hit that would eclipse Jaws as the highest grossing movie of all time. Fox had originally thought of Star Wars as a minor release compared to its other science fiction film, Damnation Alley, which, like Star Wars, had already slipped its intended 1976 release date several times. Star Wars' final budget was $11 million, which is $10,999,950 more than the budget for the Star Wars movie I made on Super 8 film. Across several releases, Star Wars has earned over $775 million at the box office. Meanwhile, my film, Star Wars 2, The Son of the Death Star, grossed $4.58 from screenings in the school library at Big Lunch, as well as a cease and desist letter from 20th Century Fox. It seems that Alec Smelly was a backstabbing narc and a dobber even at age 8.
You got your reward and you're just leaving then?
While Star Wars was in production, Lucas had in mind a lower budget sequel that he would quickly put into production if the first film wasn't much of a hit. Splinter of the Mind's Eye was originally intended to form the basis of a cheapy sequel, but in the end became one of the first pieces of what would later be termed the extended universe. However, now that Star Wars was an actual bona fide phenomenon, Lucas sighed and realised he'd now have to start work on a big sequel.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
Rewinding a bit. Remember when Lucasfilm had kept a portion of the rights to the film's tie-in merchandise? Well, a few companies were interested enough to have merchandise available in time for the film's release, things like t-shirts and posters and John Williams' soundtrack. But most of the merchandising boom wouldn't really kick off until 1978 and beyond. It was a good thing for them that Star Wars had such legs, since the merch kept selling and selling. Toy company Kenner was not a big name in the industry at the time, but they were the most far-sighted in signing up to produce Star Wars toys.
Look, sir, droid.
They decided the main line would be action figures, but smaller than the 12-inch G.I. Joe-sized dolls or Bionic Man dolls, and smaller still than Mego's popular line of Star Trek and superhero dolls. Star Wars action figures would be 3 3/4 inches, or about 9.5 centimeters, with limited articulation. This would make the figures very affordable for the time, but it would also mean a range of scaled vehicles could be produced at semi-affordable prices. One problem though was Kenner was not going to have the figures available for Christmas of 1977, so they sold an empty cardboard box that amounted to an IOU and hoped the kids didn't have connected parents.
The ability to destroy a planet is insignificant next to the power of the Force.
Those toys were a smash hit, with multiple waves of figures released up until the mid-80s. Such was the demand for all things Star Wars, everybody parodied it. But perhaps the biggest parody of all, the 1978 Star Wars Holiday Special, which was part cartoon, part variety, part musical special, and all awful.
He just didn't smell right.
So awful, in fact, that Lucasfilm has disowned most of it apart from the cartoon, which introduced Boba Fett. You know the rest. George Lucas would quickly rebrand this film as Episode 4, and then write and produce 2 sequels by other directors. Then he would sit on the films for a decade and a half before filling in the blanks on Episode 1 to 3. Once Jurassic Park showed what computers could bring to his style of filmmaking, he started work on his new trilogy, but as a test bed, he went back to restore the original trilogy and fix things that had bugged him. Well look, we will talk more about the special editions when we get round to looking at Return of the Jedi, but suffice it to say the restored picture is nice, but the weird changes are either unnecessary or just plain head-scratching. After this film did better than a helium balloon reaching the moon, George Lucas now had 2 hit movies in a row, and he would share some of the massive windfall from the success of Star Wars by rewarding contributors and cast members with points, basically a share of the film's profit. In the lead up to release, he had traded profit points with Steven Spielberg, where each had felt the other's upcoming science fiction film would be the bigger hit. Close Encounters of the Third Kind was a big hit, but it wasn't a Star Wars hit, so Spielberg did very well out of Star Wars. I, of course, grew up with Star Wars. It was apparently one of my earliest cinema-going experiences, though the earliest films I can actually remember were Close Encounters and Superman, and over the years, I've seen Star Wars more times than I can recall. So much so that I actually have to actively not watch it, otherwise I'll just zone out since I know it so well.
That's no moon. It's a space station.
It's too big to be a space station.
So now I have some thoughts.
Stay on target.
Star Wars was the first in what would become a franchise spawning multiple trilogies, spin-off movies, TV series, cartoons, books, comics, storybooks, an extended universe that was no longer canon apart from the bits that were. So it's kind of interesting to see just how Episode 4 now has the worst continuity with the rest of the series. Bit by bit, Lucas and others had ideas that didn't jibe with what he had set up in Episode 4.
What do you think of her, hon?
Trying not to, kid.
Good.
Luke and Leia being brother and sister makes this a bit creepy. Vader tortures his own daughter. Vader never once thinks it's odd that they are above the planet he grew up on. At least 50% of what comes out of Ben's mouth has a tenuous relationship to reality. Ben channels Mariah Carey as he claims to have no memory of his best friend's droids, and his description of what happened to Anakin is, in hindsight, quite self-serving. Maybe it's reconcilable if you assume Ben has spent 18 years staring at a wall in his house and perhaps gone a little doddery. However, even before George Lucas cut his storylines down to fit into one movie, he'd already had the notion that Obi-Wan would have faced off against Anakin in a volcanic location. It's just the way that it plays here tends to make Ben look either like a liar, an idiot, or around the twist, or all of the above.
He betrayed and murdered your father.
What are you going to do? Fire up the Avid?
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
Movies like Star Wars offer a feast to the senses of sight and sound, but thankfully not smell.
Stay on target.
After our heroes become soaked in a garbage compactor, all I can think of is the smell of wet garbage clinging to them afterwards.
What an incredible smell you've discovered!
They haven't had a chance to shower, so all through their escapades on the Death Star and their escape, they all stank like Limburger cheese left on the backseat of a car on a hot day. Chewbacca, who was all hair, would have smelt like a very, very large wet dog who's followed up a bath by rolling around in an open sewer. Look, now, there is a smell to remember.
You've taken your first step into a larger world.
It was all so new that everybody is still working out, for example, how to say all the various names like
Alderaan.
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 Chewbacca.
Chewbacca! Princess Leia.
Princess Leia.
Princess Leia.
Leia.
Princess, you'll find Han.
It's Han.
It's mainly delineated by the British actors saying things one way and Americans another. You know what nobody needed to work out how to say? Tatooine. Most of the first hour or so is set on the desert planet, and as far as I can tell, it is never once name-checked on screen, in the actual movie, until at least the very end of Empire Strikes Back.
Tatooine.
Sure, it's mentioned in novelizations or comics or trading cards or some other supplementary media, but not in the actual film. If it is, by all means, leave a comment and tell us where.
You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy.
The release of Star Wars in May 1977 also birthed that other phenomenon, the Star Wars fan. Star Wars fans, or at least hopefully a vocal minority, have taken this film as a template. Anything that to them deviates too far from what, or more importantly to them, who is in this film, will just set off all sorts of debates.
I'm getting too old for this sort of thing.
No, wait, no, it's not debating. What's the word I'm thinking of? It does actually rhyme with debating.
The Force can have a strong influence on the weak-minded.
For everyone else who's just enjoying the ride, Star Wars was a window into something different yet familiar.
May the Force be with you.
With Star Wars, George Lucas didn't just build a world, but a whole galaxy to explore. Assuming, of course, the entire galaxy was just one desert planet with a name that rhymed with Blatoween.
What?
Star Wars was made in the 70s, and apart from some sideburns creeping south on a few actors and some of Han's dialogue,
Not this ship, sister.
you wouldn't know it. Star Wars had a simple story trading on action, adventure, and fantasy standards, but with a unique look that set it apart. And unlike many films of the decade, there were no grey areas. It was a simple good versus evil tale. It's timeless. Star Wars is great. Or Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope is great. Even the Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope Special Edition, well, it's mostly great.
You're all clear, kid. Now let's blow this thing and go home.
I love it, and I grew up with it. So for me, Star Wars was never not great, even at times when it obviously wasn't.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
I don't know. What do you think? Do you think a princess and a guy like me?
No.
Lucas would be back with a sequel in 1980, which, while he did not direct it, The Empire Strikes Back would eventually be considered the very best Star Wars film.
Move along.
Move along.
If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
Boring conversation anyway.